It's good.
All right, so this is our usual AMC Tech Corner, and we've compressed a couple of talks into here, so we're going to go kind of quickly because, normally I'm slow and deliberate, but we're going to go fast this time. All right, so that's me, Whirlwind Tour. This is basically about what I'm working on right now. Almost all the projects are things that I actually am actively involved in. I have some other projects that aren't really active, so I'm not going to talk about them. Here's a list of the basic stuff that we're going to go through. Some of this is relevant to future discussions, so I'll note that as we go through them. All right, so first we're going to start with TxnBox. We talked about that last time. Well, I talked about that last time. And so we're going to give you an update on the state of play with that, where that project is. So the quick rehash, it's a traffic server plugin. It's supposed to substitute a variety of other plugins to make it easier to use. One of the big goals is to be YAML-based. Because we want to move toward YAML. So in many cases, we don't have to update other plugins. We can just use TxnBox instead, and it's already YAML. This originally started with Miles, thanks Miles, as a possible replacement for remap.config after the original rework was bombed at a previous summit. So this is something, when you're talking about config, something to look at as to replace that. Internally, inside Verizon Media, over the next year, we're very likely going to end up replacing our remap config with this anyway. So we're going to be moving forward on that. It's going to be it's designed to be easily extensible because I add new functionality at a time. And the documentation is getting better. It's decent now. I'm hoping to greatly improve that over the next 6 months or so. But there's some stuff up there, and it's usable now. All right, YAML config, it supports global and remap configurations. It supports most of the transaction hooks. I've been working more on features and expanding hooks, but we'll probably go for almost all the hooks at some point. And everything that happens in TxnBox is tied to a specific hook. All right, so the configuration elements, you have directives, those make things happen. We have comparisons, you can compare data to do conditional actions. We have extractors, which get data, and then modifiers, which let you tweak data you got from the extractors. So an example modifier would be, I want to get the URL and then want to hash it into 4K buckets and then use that value later. What's the state? So we have in fact achieved production deployment of TxnBox. We're at 0.2.11 right now. This is currently running today on YCPI and being used for a number of projects there. The main ones are ramping, where we control the distribution request across multiple upstreams. We say, well, we want to divert 15% of its traffic to some staging box, test it out, and gradually shift over. The big project that delayed some other things was static file capabilities, so that you could have a file on the production server and then access it from inside TxnBox. They're actually using this to put it into a header, but you couldn't use it, in fact, use it to do static replies as well. So things that we've added since the last time I talked about this, I got a lot of feedback. I want to thank the participants on the TxnBox channel. I have incorporated a number of your suggestions here. Newbury helped me a lot with the AU test support. So TxnBox is adopting AU test as its QA, primary QA facility. We added static product port, I tell you, as I mentioned. You can do response replacement now. So you can say, if I get an upstream response, how can I replace it with a different response? This is a specific ticket inside Verizon Media, where they get those 403s from Amazon, and they say, I don't know, you understand. Amazon does something weird, gives you 403s, and they wanted a 204 instead. For the configuration, we now have file globbing. The original request here was to do load directories. But when I looked at that, it really, once you go that much effort, it seemed just as useful and not any harder to implement to go ahead and do full file globbing. I put in the post load hooked, and as requested on the channel, you can now bomb the config from a post load directive. So those directives can now do status checks and say the config is not valid after it's been loaded up. And I added a global reload capability, so you can send a plugin message to TxnBox and it'll reload all the global configs. And there's been a whole bunch of renaming. Again, as requested on the TxnBox channel. I renamed a number of the directives because it made you guys happier, and your happiness is all that matters to me. I got rid of all the remap specific elements. There used to be remap host and remap directives. For the remap hook, in practice, when we tried to deploy this in production, it really just confused our ops staff. So I just took them out because really they don't do anything that you can't do with the user agent elements. So I just got rid of them all, and that seems to be simpler and easier to understand. So this is stuff that I talked about the last time, and when I talk about how they actually ended up. So the IPSpace stuff work is now available. It hasn't been production tested, but it is in the production system, so we can try that. I've got dynamic regular expressions in.
I'm sorry, you're done with the transaction box, right?
What?
So you're still on the transaction box, you're saying?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I see. So two questions. One is, like, it's still in your personal repo, right?
Yes.
And you have planned to put it onto the open source for that?
Well, we can discuss that. I don't have any, I mean, it's in my private repo because, well, at the time I started this, we didn't have you couldn't easily make repos inside Traffic Server. But there's really no good reason not to move it there at some point.
Right. Second thing is, should this be replacing header rewrite?
Yes, I expect it to completely replace header rewrite.
Okay. All right. Cool. All right.
And unfortunately for Gancho, and I deeply, deeply apologize, Gancho, the cache key plugin as well.
That's okay.
It said that once you get all this other stuff, to do the stuff the cache key does, it turns out to be really extremely trivial in TxnBox. Right, so we have IPSpace. That's basically an IP-based database. You can have a bunch of rows. Each row has an IP address range and then a bunch of properties. And you can then access this at runtime. It's really quite fast. For something, we loaded up the Verizon network set. That is literally all the networks in Verizon. And the search time is around 150 nanoseconds. So that's sufficiently real time. We have a lot more tuple support. I ended up having to add that in. I've got better documentation. I went through and improved the infrastructure there to do that. We have transaction variables, so you can have named variables that are attached to a transaction. You can set them, use them.
Cross hooks.
Cross hooks, and you can actually do them between global and remaps. You can set variables in your remap configs and then use them in your global configs in a later hook, or vice versa. The actual use for this originally was to cache stuff in the read request header hook and then look at it when you got to the remap. After, because of pristine host header and other things, I wanted to capture some data very early. We have a lot more comparisons. We have combo comparisons, IP address comparisons, numeric ones, Boolean ones. I've added duration so you can talk about time. We have some access to TLS and session data, including the SNI name. And we have random numbers because, well, everyone likes random numbers. That's actually one of the more heavily used features at this time.
So Alan,
what?
Sorry, this one, the TxnBox, will it run as a global plugin or a remap plugin?
Yes.
Which plugin will it run as, global or remap?
Both.
Oh, both. Okay.
And as I said, one of the things that's really nice is if you run it as a global and a remap, you can set the transaction variables carry over between those. So if I have a global config that's such a transaction variable, I can have a remap config that uses it.
I see.
Or vice versa, I can set it in a remap and then use it later.
Okay. Given that there is overlap with other plugins like header rewrite and cache key plugin, have we or have you thought about how to migrate those into this? Like, how do you? Is it like a like-for-like replacement, or if you want to roll this out, for example?
No, unfortunately, it's not even close to a line replacement, primarily because we're going to YAML. For cache key, it's really very simple. There's a directive cache key which lets you set the cache key. And because of the way, unfortunately, I don't have a slide here. Because of the way the feature expressions work is, you have a string and you have a bunch of substitutes inside of it, which are the extractors.
Mm.
And so you just put your string there and say, well, I want this slash, user agent path or user agent host or this header field kind of thing. And so you just put whatever you like in there and it just computes it and that sets the cache key. And that's pretty much it for replacing cache key.
Yeah, I guess my question is more of if you want to roll this out in production, which already runs header rewrite or cache key or other plugins that overlap with this. How do you do it safely? Meaning, can this coexist with other plugins and not not conflict with them? Or
well, I mean, it all depends on the config. There's no fundamental conflict, right?
But currently, you're running with header rewrite.
Yes, and conf remap too. So this does conf remap as well, including floats.
And the other question is plugin ordering. Do you have to necessarily put this at the top, or do you automatically somehow ensure this runs first? Or
no, it doesn't have to go at the top. The one consensus in there is there's a special directive for ATS 7 that lets you forcibly apply the remap rule, so that you can consistently, if you're first, you can make it act like ATS 9 on a per plugin basis.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But once you go to 9, that's really not useful, so it's dropped. Otherwise, it's just another plugin.
Okay. Yeah, I guess the ordering is slightly more interesting here because depending on the order in which it runs, the rules may or may not be matched and can cause issues. So just curious whether you thought about that.
Yeah, generally what we plan to do is for a given rule, we probably just replace everything in that rule transaction box, because then ordering is I mean, it's in your config. You say do this directive, then that directive.
Sure. So you expect the user to make sure the config is clean and there's no overlap.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's fair. Okay.
Yeah, so some of the internal things is the feature expression support. That's much better now, so that everybody gets all the directives and everybody gets to use the full feature expressions, and that's really helped. The directives can have type level initialization and config load time, so that they can share data between the directives. We have arguments to the directives and to extractors actually too. And you can store, these directive and extractors can store data per config or per transaction context. And that has some really nice uses internally. Do a bunch of fun stuff. Static files, transaction load and store. Load a file from the file system to store it internally, and then an extractor extracts it. So any place you can use any string, you can use the content of the file. You can put it in a header, you can use a response body, you can print it as a debug message. You can set them to be periodically checked for modification and automatically reloaded. So that's really nice. The post load, right? So out of the post load hook, we talked about this on the channel a lot. These are only called once per configuration load. So we load the configuration, then we run the post load hook. They can bong the configuration if they want. This is where global data type things are used. So when you define a static file in IPSpace, that's a post load directive only. So you in the post load, you say, I'm loading this static file and it's named Sudir. And then later you have an extractor that says, hey, go get the Sudir file for me. Config glob support. So now when you load files, you can put in standard file globs. And this is the bash style file globbing, right? So rather than loading a directory, you can load a directory by saying directory /star, or you can say directory /star.yaml if you just want to load the YAML files in that directory. You can have multiple patterns. You can say, I want to load this pattern, and this pattern, and this pattern. It tracks which files have been loaded. So if the file shows up in multiple patterns, it's only loaded the first time and then skipped the next time. What this is really handy for, which was something that was wanted, was to say, if I have to load this file first, you can specify it exactly and then load everything in that directory. And it'll load that file first, and then it'll load all the other ones. So that when it hits that file again, it'll say, already loaded that, I'll skip it. So this gets around some of the load ordering problems. Again, because it's using the bash, if you just want to put the 01, 02, 03 in front of the files, that works too. The global and remap configuration loads use file globbing. So you can have a remap config that loads. So if you have a property, you could have a TxnBox/property directory, and just for your remap, just load everything in there. Then when you update it, you can just throw files into that directory rather than actually updating the remap. All right, IPSpace, this loads during post load. The columns have to be an integer, a string, a flag setter, or enumeration. There's a modifier that, given an IP address, gets an IPSpace row, and then there's then there are extractors to pull out the column data from that row. And like the static files, it supports auto reload, so you can have it checked every so often to reload the file if it's changed. So again, we are currently testing an application using IPSpace that has 9 million ranges in it. And that takes about 13 seconds to fully load. So you can run some really large data sets here. However many networks you have, we can handle that. So let's actually look at some config here. So this is the classic template we're using. We're going to do some ramping. We have a remap rule that maps from X1 to X1 because that's just a normal property. But to say, hey, we want to test our staging box, staging.x.1, and we want to shift 20% of the traffic there, right? Very standard. So inside remap config, we have the rule. We specify the plugin, transaction box, and the parameter, the YAML file. Great. So that's the configuration there. We say, okay, with select is how you do conditionals inside transaction box. So random is an extractor. What it does is it extracts a random number between these two limits, 0 to 999. And then the select says, well, here's a bunch of comparisons I want to do. And when one of the comparisons is valid, do that. So this one's very simple. We just say, well, is the value less than 200? If it is, then we change the user request host to staging.x.1. Otherwise, we do nothing. We just let the remap rule do the identity remap, and off it goes. And that's pretty much it. That's how we do ramping.
I have a question. So is transaction box like a driver for all of these things? Or like when I have like transaction box, do I get all of this, or I can choose what I want to get? Or
no, all of this is it's just a plugin. All of this is in there.
So why are they called like hooks? I mean, like a couple of slides back, you mentioned that post hook, pre hook, or something like that. So why?
Right. So you have to, if transaction box is going to, for instance, change the sudoer field in the request, it needs to do that on a particular hook. So it has to do it on the user request hook, or the proxy response hook, or the server response hook.
Right.
So, but for any, well, so the set of directives you can use in a hook varies. There's some restrictions to say, well, if you're in the read request header hook, you can't set the proxy response fields because, well, it doesn't exist.
So the reason why I'm asking that question is like, looks like this, I don't know completely. I might be asking a stupid question, but it looks like there are like a lot of plugins in one plugin. How is the performance going to be impacted because of that? Because I might not even be interested in like a lot of plugins. I don't understand completely, so I might be asking a really stupid question. So
no, I don't see any really performance impact. I mean, so when it loads the config, it in effect condenses it or compiles it to a runtime list, effectively forth-like list of pointers to say, okay, well, when this hook is hit, call these functions. And if you don't use a function, it just doesn't go in the list.
Yeah, maybe just to clarify that.
It's purely based on the config.
The plugin doesn't act like all traffic has to go through this one plugin and it's locked. Multiple sessions will go through with the plugin without being.
Right, but the plugin has to register to a particular hook. So, I mean, how does the plugin know what are the various hooks that it has to register ahead of time?
No, that's all in the config. So in this case, unfortunately, we don't have a, do we have one here? Okay, I'll show you one in a second. This one, there's no explicit hook because it's on a remap rule. So conceptually wrapped with a when remap to say run when the remap hook goes off.
This is the same as how the rewrite does too. It has to do the hook, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but there are only limited set of things that you can do with header rewrite. But here it looks like you can do everything. Or like
Yes.
It's the
almost.
same concept of hook though. You still have to specify the hook. The default here is in a remap plugin is to be as part of the remap phase. If it's not, then you assume you have to specify somewhere in the config, in the YAML, that you want to run this in a particular hook.
Let's go to the next slide then. So here's how we do a static file. So this shows an example. So there's the config. So we say when post load. That says what hook to do the directives inside a list. So we have a when and a do. When says, here's the hook. Do says, here's the list of directives that I want you to execute on that hook.
Okay, so my post load is like the hook that you.
Yes.
What is post load?
I have some hook that translates to some traffic of hook, I guess.
Yeah. So post load. This came out of discussions that we had on the TxnBox channels. Post load is called exactly once per configuration load, and it's called immediately after the configuration has been loaded, but before any traffic hits.
So let's see, set up globals.
Yeah. It also, and again, and this is a key request from the gang there, was that you can have directives return error conditions, which then prevent the configuration from loading. So you can have directives that check properties or other things to say, well, this didn't work, don't actually run this config.
And that's not what this is.
That's not what this is doing. This is saying, so we don't want to load the static file every single transaction, right? You want to say, at the beginning of time, after you load the config, go over and load up this file for me. So text block define says, hey, I'm going to define a text block. There's the path I want you to read from. There's the name of it. And I want you to check every 8 hours to see if it's changed. So that runs once after the configuration is loaded, and then it stores the contents of token.txt in internal storage for later use. Down below that, we have a when proxy request. This means the hook send proxy request. This is when traffic server is sending the request upstream. So when that hook happens, we again have do. It has a list of directives to run. We're only going to have one on the list, which is proxy request field token. So that says, okay, I want you to set the value of the token field in the proxy request. And this uses a modifier. So it's a list. And so the first element is the base value. So what we do is we go ahead and we fetch the current value of the proxy request field named token. And then the modifier is else. Now what else does is say, well, if the value is there, I do nothing. If the value isn't there, then I'll take my expression and I'll use that instead. So the effect of this is to say, if the token field is already set, don't do anything. If it's not, I want you to use this default token here and put that in the field and send that up. So that every request has the token field filled. If it's not set from some other plugin, we set it here with this static define.
When you say token field, that's a token header and a token named a header named token.
Yes.
Okay. So this is not a server intercept. It's still just modifying the headers.
Correct.
Okay. That's confusing in this example because I read this as this is serving static files as the body of the response.
Oh, okay. Well, then it's just a bad name thing. We're serving the static file as the contents of the token field if it's not already there.
Header, who calls it field?
Header's the whole thing. This is just a single field.
Sure.
Anyway, so the else has actually turned out to be really sweet. It lets you do a lot of fun things here. So this is how you do default setting. So, anyway, so one little note here is the things in quotes are feature expressions, and those are by default literal strings unless there's an extraction syntax in it. If you don't have the quotes, then it tries to first parse it as some basic type like an integer or an IP address. If that doesn't work, it assumes that's an extractor of some sort and goes ahead and does that. So ours is an extractor. Proxy request field is an extractor. Text block is an extractor. And so for text block, we give it the argument token. So it goes and it says, well, is there a text block named token? Oh, there it is. I'll use that. So anyway, I'm going to move on. I can give you guys documentation links or the talk from the previous time, which goes into a lot more detail on this. So things we still have to do here, I need to do string matching acceleration, which Damien is working on with me. Thank you, Damien. Argument direction for dynamic arguments. So here, the arguments to all of these are all literals. I want to eventually be able to have dynamic values. That's kind of low priority, but it'd be nice. Comparison local modifiers. That's, well, I can't explain it. We'd have to sit down for a while. More tuple operators, you can say for all or for every. So if you have a list of things, you can check whether all the values have this property or none of the values have this property. I also want to do dynamic DSO loading invocation, so you can in fact have plugins in the plugin. There's some really nice use cases for that. In terms of being able to provide very property or proprietary features inside TransactionBox without having to write yet another plugin. All right. Any final questions on TransactionBox? So this is coming along very nicely. So, probably next.
Sorry,
I have one more question.
Okay.
So does the transaction box completely depend on libsw or C++? Can it run without that?
No.
Can it work?
No, it's complete. It draws much of its functionality and power from libswap. Like for instance,
okay.
Almost all of IPSpace is implemented inside libswap. I mean, we could copy the files over, but I don't really see the benefit of that. We'll talk about libswap again in a bit, though. Sudhir.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi. So Alan, why did you see the need to make this plugin also a remap plugin? Seems like a global plugin would do, and I mean, if the way
that's actually a very interesting question, Sudhir. The answer is that yes, in theory, it should have just been a global because eventually it's going to replace in our remap config, and so you can just do all your selection. So the selection properties are at least as powerful as remap, but now you can slice things in any way you like.
Right.
The problem is transition. So in order to get this deployed in prod and used now, today, I have to support remap.
Mm.
If I could snap my fingers and just replace everything, then no, I wouldn't have had to do that.
Okay, yeah. Seems like this plugin should run as one unit, just one global plugin, which can basically cover most of the other normal operations plugins and consolidate everything into one place. And it's more clear if it's a global and runs ahead of everything. It probably could cover a lot of corner cases that can happen because of ordering and things like that. But the fact that we support a remap mode may be a problem eventually when we want to not support it anymore.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, unfortunately, to move forward, I just had to do it. It's a necessary evil.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, we're doing something similar to this, but mainly focused for routing. I only plan to have it as a global plugin, and it's basically a replacement to all the other routing plugins we have. And the objective is to solve the ordering issues we run into from time to time. Like there's no good way to ensure the ordering with every plugin hooking at the same hook and trying to do the same thing. So yeah.
Well, tell me your routing things, and I'll put all those features in the transaction box.
Right. Yeah.
All right, I got to keep moving here. So some minor updates. So this went out in the mailing list. Damien is got a PR up. He mentioned that. So basically, I want to be able to control whether my plugin gets reloaded in a remap. So that's up there. Basically, I can get my plugin to act in the pre-ATS 9 style. And this is per plugin because my plugin knows whether it can be reloaded or not. The administrator has no idea. I'm working on an update to internal message buffer. This which should warm Leif's heart because this enables, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change it from a string, just an allocated string, into an IO buffer chain. So you can just write, and as it expands, it just adds new IO buffer blocks again instead of reallocating and copying, which in certain cases we've had severe performance problems with. It also will enable doing smarter things in some of the template stuff, in that you don't have to have all those magic constant reallocations of stuff. You can just ship it out to a buffer chain. So this is probably about 60% complete. I'm just getting back to that today, actually, after this. So that's going to be a non-trivial change. So I really wanted you guys to see that. It unfortunately, it touches a bunch of stuff. But heads up on that. This is something we've been kicking around for literally years, right, Leif? No, he's drunk. All right. The down server recheck, this came up too. Currently, if the server is down, there's no protection on it at all. I'm probably going to work on this later this month or early next month. Actually, I worked on it quite a bit, and I had to put it off because of internal emergencies, dumpster fires, whatever. So the concept here is that when the server is down, there's a full black period where nothing goes through, and then after that, the first time a request hits it, lets one through, and then starts that blackout period again. And if that connection doesn't work, well, then it just keeps waiting until the block period is over and then tries again. If it succeeds, then it gets marked as up, and then everyone gets to go through. This prevents this pounding on the servers when they're down every so often, or just completely. Anyway, so that's going to be another non-trivial change. Probably end of July is where I think that'll probably be done. All right. So
how is that different from the parent selection stuff? Because it sounds sort of similar.
Well, this isn't about marking things down. This is the server's down, how to control connections to it.
You detected that it seemed to be out, right?
Yeah, this doesn't worry about why it's marked down. It just says, oh, this server is down, and I should ping it every now and then to see if it's coming back up.
Okay.
Is that built into the parent selection stuff too, the retries?
Yeah.
No, this is more of a health check. Is parent selection doing health checking now?
So who does
No, it
that? So
doesn't
this
do any
is
health checking, but
No, this isn't doing any, yeah.
Well,
we should
this is
probably
a
talk
substitute
about
for
it.
health check, right?
Yeah, because all the code none of the code I'm modifying or looked at is in parent selection at all.
This is all inbound stuff, or is it? Sorry, out of band or out of bound? Sorry, out of band or in band, like requests.
This is in-band, outbound.
Yes. Okay. So I mean, we already have dead server. It's just dead server continues to retry for every request. I think there was a modification at one period of time where it actually did set it to only try after the dead time out period, but for some reason that doesn't look like that's in open source right now. It still tries at least
once. It should be working right now.
I think it tries at least once still for every request.
It was, we were having performance problems with this where things went down because actually the DNS broke, and the ATS would just keep right on pounding these servers.
Yeah.
And there's just nothing that slows it down currently. So this goal is to control that leakage so that it only hits one per time period until the thing comes up again. But maybe you should bug me offline, Evan.
So this just checks whether it should. I mean, it basically blocks for a certain period of time. Doesn't go and like connect to that particular server. It doesn't do any health check, right? I don't.
No.
How does
it indirectly does a health check. What it does, it says, I've got a block time. Any request that comes in for the upstream during the block time, it just gets an instant 502. Wham.
Yeah, but where is the health check? I mean, it's not going to go and connect to that particular server, right? I mean, where is the health check? Okay, so it's not really a health check.
It's going to connect to that particular server. After the block time, the next request that comes in is allowed to go upstream to that server.
One.
Just one, not all of them.
One.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Okay, so kind of like a passive health check, not like really the passive health check, whatever.
Yes.
Okay.
Because the goal here, the bug that came down to me, the request that came down to me for this is not to do health checks. It's to stop this upstream server from getting the heck pounded out of them.
I do have actually a change for dead server to actually, so we can, if you set it to like a negative value, it would actually not check the server, because unfortunately we have dead server retries. Setting it to 0 still tries once.
Yes.
but I do have a change that setting it to a -1 will not try until the timeout period. But then it opens the floodgates, and you may get pounded.
But there is a limit also, right? I mean, like how many times it should connect even after the dead period. I thought there's like another timeout for another retries time for that. Number of times it should retry the dead server.
Yeah, you can set it down to 1. That's the lowest you can set it down to.
Right.
But that's per request, VJ. Per request.
Right.
So
that's still per request.
Requests come in, you're going to hit that dead server 20,000 times. This one says if 20,000 requests comes in, we let 1 upstream connection through.
No, but that one request, the first request that goes and tries the dead server, it's again marks it down. It's not going to retry again. The next request is not going to retry again.
Yeah, but you may you may get a whole bunch of parallel ones at the same time. But
yeah, we were seeing huge spikes.
Yes, that's the effect we actually saw.
Okay, it's kind of like passive health check broken or something like that.
It's a passive health check, but again, my primary goal here is to protect the origin. The fact that it also does some health checking is nice, but it's not really the point of it. It's about origin protection.
Okay.
All right, so some YAML stuff that I'm looking at. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. So this is a request I got. So there's 4 different configuration files for configuring the cache because we love config files. So rather than converting all those to YAML, I think I'm going to have a single configuration file. Replace all these, well, 2 of these with a configuration file, and replace the other 2 with plugin API. So expose the hosting config, the Stripe cache volume assignment, and the cache config to plugin APIs. Then you have a plugin that tweaks all that for you. And then just the storage is defined in cache.config. And so my original view is it would look something like this. Root key cache, because we agree everything has a root key that's distinct. It then has a storage key, which says it has a list. Each list says, here's the path, the size, a tag for it, a seed, which is currently the ID value. So you can have the consistent hashing on it, has a fixed seed rather than device path, which can change. And then there's another subkey, volumes, which lists all the volumes. It's a list. So you give a tag for each one. You enable the RAM cache or not. You say, well, here's the storage you're going to use, which is a list. Each element of the list has a key, which refers back to the storage elements, and then how much size of that storage you want to use. We need to have a special case of star to be more consistent with the current one, where you can just say, I want this volume to use 20%. And that means 20% of all the storage units. So you really want to be able to do that here to do it, but for a lot of people now want to be very careful to say this volume uses these particular storage units, right? So I think Evan promised to help me review this, right, Evan?
Yeah, I think I did at some point.
All right, so there it is. We can discuss it later, but go ahead and give me your thoughts on this. I really think I'd like to move some of our stuff out of those config files and make them pure plugin things. If that's really popular, we can go ahead and look at putting it here. We'd probably attach it to like options to volumes here. To say, well, what paths do you need to match? What other options do you want to set here? All right. So yeah. So one of the advantages of going to a plugin is it gives you this really fine-grained control over where exactly your requests are getting stored and what knobs are getting tweaked on them. So I think in the long run that'll be better. I'll of course extend TxnBox to support this. So if you're using that, you can just configure it in there. Okay, so records.config. I think Will's going to be working on this. Thanks, Will. You're the best. So we want to YAMLize this as well. So all right, so the consensus is we're going to use a tree form, right? That's what they said on the mailing list. Yes?
I think a tree is best.
Okay. That seems to be the consensus. We're going to get rid of the proxy config prefix. We're not going to have a proxy config stuff. We'll just get rid of that because it's useless. Otherwise, the initial work is simply going to directly translate from the current names to the tree in the obvious way, right?
I think if we do this, when we do this, I agree with all this, but I think we should go through the namespace as well. It's a bit of a mess and inconsistent.
Can we do that in a second pass? What I'd really like to do is do a first pass, maybe not even commit the PR, but just have it as a PR to say, well, here's the basic work, here's the conversion. Then we can say, okay, well, I really hate this naming thing here. Can we move it over there?
That's fine as long as it goes into the same, because this has to wait to the next major version anyways, right? So
yes, yeah, this has to wait for 10. I mean, I can't imagine this going into 9.
But we will need to break this sort of naming convention. We should do it once and not like multiple times. So we should do it right for that release.
Yeah, I think it'll be easier if we do a first pass and then do a cleanup.
That's fine. It doesn't have to be boiling the ocean here. I mean, as long as someone agrees. And again, it comes back to sort of the ownership, right? If whoever does this refactoring doesn't then drive the fact that we also want to clean up the namespace, then we have a problem, right? Because then we get stuck with a sort of partially finished project.
All right, I'll take responsibility for driving the renaming. Will, I think, is what we think.
Yeah, someone didn't agree with that.
Wow. Sorry. I guess I've been vetoed.
I think someone looked at LibSwalk.
All right, so one of the issues that we have to think about here, or I have to think about, is that we just had a talk internally in Verizon Media about this universal configuration setting stuff. And the interesting piece out of that was they're not going to allow you to update arbitrary subtrees. They were going to have an explicit list of here's the config points that you can change. And when you change them, you have to provide everything that you would have had in the config file below there. Now, for things that are simple or basic types like ints and floats and strings, this is a non-issue, right? Because the entire thing under there is a string. You have to run a string. Great. For things that are more complex, I think we're going to have to look at doing this too, to say, well, you can't just grab an arbitrary piece in your records.config and change it, right? There are well-defined points in that tree that can be changed. Does that make any sense? Seeing a lot of blank looks here.
I'd
All right.
say no at the moment because I'm not quite sure where that configuration talk you're mentioning stated that explicitly.
No, I asked them that.
I think that was a miscommunication, but maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, no, because I wondered about that, and I, as far as I understand, I asked them explicitly about this and said, no, you are going to define what the config points are. So anyway, all right, so we're going to go ahead and work on that. So another thing Susan and I were working on is IPAllow and SNI configuration. We're having some issues internally because these basically do very similar things. Spent some time with Susan talking about this. What we'd like to do is have a more unified one. So again, like the cache, not to have 15 different config files that kind of sort of do the same thing, but not quite. So we're thinking about having a new config file, inbound.yami. This replaces IPAllow and replaces SNI config. And it's all about, I've got SNI YAML, sorry. It's all about, I've got an inbound configuration. I want to set certain properties about it. So it's going to be fundamentally TLS based, and we'll handle the non-TLS case as a special case, which is different than a TLS that doesn't have an SNI name. So for each SNI name, you have an IP map. It matches ranges to properties and actions, which are like, I want to tunnel this, I'm going to close it, I don't want to do this, I want to do that. We'd support all the current SNI options, plus the method list allow from IPAllow. And we're looking at supporting a global record, which says always apply the global record and then find the SNI specific one and apply that. That lets you set some nice basic security issues on stuff and then put exceptions in for more privileged SNI names. Does this sound somewhat reasonable? Although, keep this in mind when we have the config going forward discussion. This is something I want to throw out into that discussion.
I mean, this really, that definitely needs to go to the mailing list, and
Okay.
we probably need even have probably even a talk basically on the details and stuff like that, because that has huge
Yeah.
implications.
Yes, well, that's one of the I wanted to bring it up now because I wanted to discuss it tomorrow and then have at least some sort of sketch of what we want to do to send to the mailing list.
Also, doesn't IPAllow also do some outbound rules? Because you can tell where to apply it on the in or the out.
Oh, that's true. It does. Ooh, I
Yep.
don't like it anymore.
You added that, Alan, so
Yep.
then I forget about it.
Yeah.
Outbound.yaml.
Yeah, I was just making outbound of YAML, all right.
Yeah, that's actually a good. Let me write that down. That's
It might
probably
actually be
better idea.
cleaner that way, actually.
So you guys would be basically okay with that?
No, but we'll consider it.
All right.
Sounds like a
Anyway, I want to get more into this. I'm going to skip it now. I want to get more into this tomorrow when we talk about the config going forward. All right. And then we'll see what we all want to do there. All right, libswak. So this is a fork of some ATS core utilities. I've added a few more classes since then. I forked it so I could develop at a more rapid pace. TxnBox is highly dependent on this. Almost all the functionality that I'm using now is used in TxnBox. It's actually getting somewhat mature. We could probably at this point pull it back into the TS core. Unfortunately, it's now been picked up by a couple other projects, which is good and bad. So we may need to keep it as a separate repo, but again, we could move it to under the traffic server repo. Some of the IPAllow SNI work, we wanted to use this. It makes parts of that much more easily. We could import it in a libyaml CPP style, where rather than mixing it in the core, we just do a drop of a particular release, put that in, and then build it there. So that's something to think about. It does have really nice documentation. You should check it out. That's one of the things that's a big difference over some of the stuff in the core, is that the documentation is really quite a lot better, which unfortunately can't be backported because it matches the libswak implementation, not the ATS implementation. So that's something I think we should think about at some point. Not urgent, but it's out there. So it's a much better text view. I regularized all the method names, so that's much nicer. We have the lexicon class that I've wanted for a long time. With such a very nice enumeration, bidirectional mapping, enumerations of strings and vice versa. Very handy for parsing and debugging messages. We have IPSpace, which replaces IPMap. It's just a much superior version of that. Arbitrary user data types, different types of adding IPSpace, IP ranges to it. I added the Memorina, which is, again, an updated version, a write from scratch to replace the current arena.h. It has all the features of that plus more, and better documentation. So that's some stuff to think about. So one of the big initiatives we've recently taken up inside Verizon Media is what I'm going to call managed ATS. So this is something that I've been kicking around for a couple of years, and other people have brought it up, but now the ops team has finally gotten on board with it. And this is, Kit's been working in things in the same general area, is that we want to do better about elastic services and more dynamic environments. We need ATS to be easier and more convenient to manage in automated fashion, both for deployment and management. So we have to be able to get new instances out there and configure them very rapidly and very easy with standard sorts of things. So Kit's ingress controllers in the same sort of area, and he's going to talk about that. That's tomorrow, I think. So things that I think we need to do are, that I'm working on, is more standards-based administrative control. This is what the JSRPC project is actually all about. That's why it got authorized, is because it's part of this overall work. All the YAML stuff we just talked about is, again, a derivative of this larger project, because we want to go and make this easier to config, and having all, why did I spell JSON that way? Golly.
Because you love JSON.
Because I love JSON. To make this more standards compliant. So all the projects I talked about are things that are getting underway so that I can do this. We want to do minimal install footprint, so Damien's actually fixed up some of the missing file stuff so that if the file's missing, it defaults to empty and you just don't have to have that. I'm trying to have fewer configuration files, again, just to make it easier to get them all on the disk. Faye, thanks Faye, you're the best, is working on stability issues in the limited resource environment, so tracking memory issues, best practices, that kind of thing. So then Faye, Susan, and Brian are working jointly on figuring out common scenarios for this and designing best practices for deploying in that kind of environment. Is that right, Sue?
Yeah.
So, and they'll be working closely with Faye to make sure that these best practices actually are in fact stable and best. So, so this is probably going to be one of my organizing principles for the next year or so. TxnBox has now been slotted under this as another way to be more consistent in the configuration. And so the upshot of that, to a large extent, is JSON all the way down, right? We've already committed to having YAMLs or basic configuration syntax, and in case anyone doesn't realize it, if it's JSON, it's YAML. Any valid JSON file parses a valid YAML file, so I use them somewhat interchangeably. So the idea here is we say everything's JSON. You know, you don't need remap config, you got TxnBox, you use JSON there. We convert the other configuration files, the basic ones that we need for this, to JSON YAML. We have the RPC as JSON. So just a very consistent, it's JSON. If you work with JSON, you can deploy and manage and config traffic server. So, and that makes it easier internally because the developers don't need to learn another tool chain. We're already using JSON YAML. It's just the same thing. So that's a theme that I have for this project, and I think it's, you know, I don't want to be too hyperbolic, but really getting this easy to manage is really going to be a key thing in getting this staying relevant as we move into a more elastic computation arena. And that's it. Any questions? I stunned them all.
Okay, if there isn't any questions.
I had questions halfway through, but you answered them. So
Darn it all.
Okay. Well, so yeah, I want to leave the config and the RPC stuff till tomorrow. We have a slot set up for this. I wanted to present this as my take on that stuff as a starting point for discussion, and then we'll dive deeper in that time slot. So
one thing I did want to observe, the putting a fair amount of effort into making you know, that JSON RPC remote interface into ATC or ATS. If you go to TxnBox, you don't want to necessarily lose that dynamic remote configurability. So you may want to think about how TxnBox should relate there.
Yeah.
It's not straightforward.
Well, I'm not sure what the problem is. I mean, so TxnBox has YAML files. You can update those on the disk and then send a message to say, TxnBox, reload yourself.
So you want to do it remotely via your managed interface, right?
Right. So like with JSON RPC, I can do config set, right?
Oh, yes. Well, this is what I was talking about the control points.
Yeah.
So if you allow trying to touch arbitrary parts of the tree, I actually thought about that, and that gets really ugly really quickly.
Yes, yes, it does.
So I think we really want to, that's the reason I say we really want to be able to predefine and say, okay, these are the points in the tree that you can change the config, and you have to change the tree from all the way down from there. Otherwise, it gets, the logic to do the merging and whatnot just really gets out of hand really quickly.
Yeah. But being able to get and set that via some sort of an interface would be, and maybe even if it's a generic interface, right? Maybe I send maybe in our JSON RPC, we just expose an endpoint to allow plugins to respond to a message, right?
Yeah, so that's one of the things I want to do, because remember, we already have plugin message via this RPC.
Right.
That. And the ability for a plugin to respond to a message with basically JSON data, I think people are going to really like that.
Yeah, I can think of dozens of useful ways of handling that.
So I think that'll be really nice. All right, so let's go on to the next one.